I'm stressing the private sector part of this issue in particular because it's very important that we understand that the engine for growth in most countries is certainly not going to be the aid community. The international partners that I've explained about in previous lectures, the multilateral agencies, the bilaterals, the NGOs, obviously we have a major role to play. But at the end of the day, the true change, the sea change that we will see in countries in terms of their economic development will be direct foreign investment. This is the key. So ODA here means overseas development assistance, and you can see the levels, the red bar. FDI is private foreign direct investment in developing countries. So the ODA, which is the official development assistance, as I explained, coming from the multilateral, the bilateral players in these situations, taxpayers' money, you can see it's significant, but it pales by comparison to what the private sector is investing in these same countries. This is really where the engine of development will come from in all countries, and we have historical perspective on this to know that this is how societies develop. And corruption, at the end of the day, deters foreign investors. Here's a graph that shows you the probability of investment loss due to corruption within 5 years. So for companies, using the example that I used at the beginning of companies going into a country and the supply side corruption issues of, again, the cost of doing business in a particular country, this is an example. So the probability of investment losses would be less than 5% in the case of the US down there, not to say there isn't corruption here. Singapore, Italy goes all the way up, and then much higher to countries where you can see that a significant percentage, almost 100% in some cases, of corruption, investment loss in foreign investment. You can well understand why in many countries around the world the private sector thinks twice about even beginning to be interested in working in particular countries. So on the demand side for corruption, for the business community has to set an example. The business community has to be very careful going into various countries how they're going to operate. There's that sense of leadership, and that the way that they operate is the way others will then follow. Others will then see when they set an example. So the business community, both international and also local, has to have a reputation for equity and fairness, transparency and accountability, and showing that they're responsible in helping to develop the institutions for corporate governance in that country where they are. That's through transparency. Independent auditing is a very, very key issue in many countries where there simply are not audits of the books. No one's checking the books. So anything could be going on. Independent auditing is a fundamental issue for accountability in any country. Conflicts of interest involved oftentimes with board of directors and managers, procedures for bankruptcy, property rights. You're investing in various countries and no one's really quite sure who owns what land. Contract enforcement, even when you have agreements and you have clear understandings that are legal, or you think they are legal, you coming in from outside, and there's actually no enforcement mechanism. There's no legal recourse that you may have as a foreigner or as a foreign business. These are all major impediments otherwise to good, solid economic development in these countries. Quality of rule of law is a very key aspect. Oftentimes you need to consider, and that when you go in, you as a company, as an investor, are looking at working in a particular country. All of the agreements that you may have, that you've agreed to govern your terms of engagement, shall we say, and your investment in that country, will not be worth the paper they're written on if there's no quality of rule of law, that there's some legal recourse which you have regardless of who you are and your nationality and your connections with, regardless of your connections with the president or his family or whatever. And here, this graph again shows you a few examples of areas in the world. This is a subjective indicator, of course, but good quality of rule of law in OECD countries. That would be first world countries. East Asia somewhat less. MENA is the Middle East and North Africa. South Asia, Eastern Europe, it keeps going down to the former Soviet Union. So as part of all of this understanding that we're looking at now in terms of how corruption and accountability work, you've got to have a basis for rule of law that's understood and fair and equitable and transparent for all players. This is a fairly dense slide with a concept that can be a bit anecdotal at times, and it may be hard to follow. And I'm just going to highlight a few key aspects of what we call the dividend of good governance. But you'll have a chance to look at this slide and study it separately on your own. I'm just going to step back and make a few comments about a few key messages in this slide. The dividends of good governance is really something that become a more recent concept, I think, for us, or a new way of looking at the importance of good, stable institutions in governments and their relationship to sustainable development and in improvement in the lot of the hungry poor in various countries. Upper left-hand corner is the first graph on infant mortality, the connection between infant mortality and control of corruption. And you can see that the higher mortality rates are in countries that also have less control over their corruption. Now, think for a moment why that would be. I mean, we could have a whole debate, a whole seminar, a whole lecture just on that particular indicator. But just one thing just to keep in mind, a little food for thought, is in countries with rampant corruption, as I've explained, it's a huge drain on the national economy. Cash that would otherwise be working in the economy for some economic benefit is going into people's pockets. Well, for example, what are the key concerns for infant mortality? Well, access to health care, access for young girls who later become pregnant and have children, access to information about hygiene and raising their children in a healthy manner. If you have less money going into, let's say, public education, funding public health care, you could well imagine how, indeed, there could be higher mortality rates, and there's a correlation there. Not one that would normally be seen, but when you look at it through this particular perspective, you can clearly see how the dividends of good governance can work. Another one would be per capita income and regulatory burden. So there, what we mean is that more money is earned by more people, higher amounts per person, per capita, in countries that have less of a regulatory burden. So again, that means that countries that have good, clear rule of law, good governance, and that they have democratic institutions which are functioning, and minimal rules and regulations. And it's not that rules and regulations are a bad thing, of course, but in many countries, what we've seen time and time again is that there'll be extra regulations and extra rules and hoops, if you will, to jump through that many corporations, many citizens will have to achieve a certain outcome, far more than they would otherwise be. And oftentimes these are on the demand side, on the civil service side of corruption, simply as job-creating opportunities. For example, one country that I was in order to get my residence visa extended for myself and my family, we had 20 different steps that we had to go through within the government in order to get the residence visa extended. Now, when I was first told that by my staff, I raised my eyebrows and said, why 20 steps? And There were like 10 different ministries involved as well. And my staff member who was involved in this on the administrative side and was doing much of it for me, thankfully, otherwise I would never have been able to do it on my own, explained that actually it could be done probably by 2 different stops, 2 different places, but that there were all these extra steps because it was employment creation. Really, there were all these extra civil servants who had a job of stamping that visa, stamping this form, stamping this, signing here, and it was a way of creating more jobs within the civil service. A particular numbers of politicians, whatever, had decided that this is a good thing to dole out the jobs here and there. These people are making very minimal salary, but the point is they have a government salary. And that is a long story to explain what regulatory burden can be oftentimes, can very much get in the way and stifle creativity and basically cause people not to be as free with their money in terms of their investments and such, and not being able to develop their economy well, which is where the link with per capita income comes in. On the lower left then is literacy and rule of law. Now again, what would be the connection between the rule of law and literacy again, where there's higher incidence of respect for rule of law in countries, there's also a higher literacy rate. Well, what is that again? Why that connection? Once again, we could have a whole lecture, a whole seminar just on that subject. But one thought to keep in mind is educated people, those who had more access to education, question. They're aware. What is law? What is justice? Why is it this way in my country? Well, I've become educated. I've understood how it maybe used to be or how it is elsewhere, and why don't we have that here? Those who are educated feel empowered to question. Why is this happening in this particular way? Governments will then respond. This is what basic democracy is really about, is people asking questions and government feeling that they need to be responsive then because their population is asking, and rule of law is a key aspect of that. And more adherence and respect for the rule of law you will generally find in countries with a higher percentage of people who are educated. And lastly, the link with per capita income and voice and accountability. And this is very much tied in with all of these, really, the per capita income and the literacy graphs, in that the higher your income, you could say your per capita income is similar with the one above, you also see more public voice. That's what's meant by voice here. Voice and accountability. Voice, that is, people in a democracy speaking out and wanting to know what's going on. And then accountability on the side of the government. So it very much follows from the literacy and rule of law point, in that when you have an educated segments of population, hopefully as many of the population as possible, where they feel they have a voice, they have a role, they have something to say, and they will not be criticized or worse for saying it, government will then feel, on the other hand, they need to then be accountable to these same people asking questions, and that people will feel more comfortable and more safe and secure in their society, so that they will make investments. They will earn money, they will invest money, they will generally help to make the economy develop by being part of the economy and feeling safe and secure that they have a vested interest for themselves and their children and their family generations to come in that economy developing. These are very key aspects of how societies can develop with good governance.